Welcome to the May 2nd, 2024 Talk with the Doc with Dr. Timothy Leichliter of Allegheny Health Network. Thank you, Dr. Leichliter.
Thank you, Casey. I got my tea. We got chamomile going on today, so it should be good. Welcome to the party, everybody. I'm Dr. Leichliter. For those of you who know me, welcome back. For those of you who don't, welcome. As Casey said, if you're new, I'm a movement disorder specialist, so-called movement disorder specialist here at Allegheny Health Network. I'm a neurologist who specializes in Parkinson's disease. And this is a great place to get your questions answered. And so Casey didn't mention it, but the best way to send your messages are in the chat box down at the bottom, sort of in the middle. You can type it in there and I will answer the questions. This is a good place for general type questions, maybe things that might benefit everybody. It's not a great place to get one-on-one care. I would suggest you talk to your doctor. The other thing I like to throw out is everything you hear is my opinion. I have a lot of opinions and I will tell you all of my opinions, but it is my opinion nonetheless. You may go to a different neurologist or a different movement disorder specialist, and they may have a different opinion, and that's okay. Generally, I give you the best information that I can, as scientifically backed as I can, but again, sometimes there just isn't any data to back it up. And so I make stuff up and I'll throw up some quotation marks and tell you that I'm making stuff up, which I do from time to time. So with that being said, I did get some messages in the email, and so I'll start there. Otherwise, send in your questions, type them in the box, and I will go to that after these. So the first two questions I got were actually articles. So one was, what if dopamine is not actually depleted in Parkinson's disease? There was a Denmark study that showed that they basically did scans to look at the dopamine neurons, and it didn't look like, especially in early Parkinson's disease, that the number of dopamine cells or brain cells were diminished. It actually wasn't until later in the disease, much after symptoms had progressed and symptoms were on, that they actually started to notice the loss of cells. Don't really know what to do with that information. At the end of the day, we've been studying dopamine and we've been working on dopamine for a long time. We've stained people with Parkinson's disease brains and it doesn't show up as black as it should, and that's what led us to this. But again, that was back in the 1960s. I don't know that we've ever actually gone back and repeated any of those, autopsy studies or measurements. But my argument would be, well, at this point, it doesn't really make a difference. We know the medicines work, regardless of whether or not the cells that make dopamine or the dopamine producing cells are depleted or not. So dopamine definitely plays a role here. And this segues into the next one, which I'll talk about. But at the end of the day, maybe that gives us an opportunity to target or to study or to test at some point. But with what I have today, that doesn't really change anything that I would do. If the cells are lost or not, the end result is the end result. And I'm going to treat symptoms the best way I can treat symptoms with the best medicines that I have. And that's unfortunately or unfortunately the dopamine medications. And so while I don't know what's actually going on in human brains when we're dealing with these things, we do know what the medicines can and can't do. And I also know that the best I can do from a medication or a treatment strategy standpoint is symptom control. Hopefully research like this, where they're actually looking at the brain in real time, or they're looking at the number of neurons that have dopamine producing capabilities. Hopefully things like this help us get to the bottom of it, which is, where does this come from? What is the source? What is the cause? And how do we fix it? So it was an interesting study that I did look at. I'm not sure it helps me take care of patients any better, but at the end of the day, hopefully or potentially it could lead to some information that might give us better directions. And likewise, the same study, the second study that was sent to me, which was, what if brain cells are not dead in Parkinson's disease? So apparently out of New York, they were looking at and found that supposedly the neurons, the dopamine producing neurons, they didn't think were dead. They were quote unquote senescent or asleep. And in this senescent or asleep state, or in fact, they use the word zombie state, perhaps that could spread to other dopamine producing neurons and make them turn into a zombie state. And this actual idea of spread of dopamine neuron to dopamine neuron, I learned about almost 10 years ago when I went to the movement disorder conference, where they were talking about how this spreads from cell to cell. And I think they touched on this a little bit in the article. But again, at the end of the day, doesn't really change anything I can or can't do. If the cells are dead, if the cells are just asleep and can't be resurrected, end result is the same. And so what I'm going to do day to day clinic practice, taking care of patients is going to be the same. Again, another interesting thought though, because if really they aren't dead and they're just senescent or in the zombie state, could we resurrect them? Could we bring them back? Again, both of these studies I thought lead to potential further studies, but they don't actually help me take care of patients or have any better understanding of what's going on in your brain from a day-to-day standpoint. Again, I'm always interested in stuff like this because I do think it's things like this that lead to the next step or the next study that might actually get us to what we're looking for, with this disease modification or potentially a cure. It's just kind of early steps, and I'm not sure where that's going to go. But interesting studies, keep sending them to me. Last month, I briefly discussed the use of medical marijuana in the treatment of Parkinson's. When I started taking carbidopa levodopa, I recall that the pharmacy data sheet that accompanied the prescription said in all caps that alcohol and marijuana should not be used. Is this big pharma scare tactics? I like that. Or is there real danger to use pot, medical or otherwise, while taking this popular Parkinson's disease medications? And that's a great question. You know, there's a whole bunch of literature that comes with your medicines on things you can't take, things you shouldn't take. I probably field this question most for like over-the-counter cold medicines, which every cold medicine known to man says, do not take if you have Parkinson's disease. And there are some theoretical risks in mixing of the medications, but realistically, I have found them to be fairly safe. So I've been a certifier of medical marijuana for, I don't know, however long it's been approved for. And I have had plenty of patients with Parkinson's disease take medical marijuana or use a variety of different kinds. The vast majority of my patients are on carbidopa levodopa, if not some other dopamine producing or replacement medication. And so at the end of the day, I have never once, knock on wood, never once run into a situation where there was an interaction. Could there be additive side effects? Sure. I mean, both can make you tired, both can probably lower your blood pressure, both can make you sick to your stomach occasionally. And so could there be complications? Probably, but I think it comes down more to side effects than actual interactions. And again, I think the same thing is true with a lot of the over-the-counter things where, you know, I usually recommend plain medicines. So none of the D's or the DMs, because it's the additives that could potentially interact with medicines to affect blood pressure. But again, as long as you're using, you know, relatively plain medicines, Mucinex, Robitussin, over-the-counter cold medicines, things like that. And the same thing is true for medical marijuana. I really have not run into too many side effects, interactions, problems. Again, you always have to be careful. And if you do have a question, definitely send a message to your neurologist or whoever takes care of you, just to be sure they're okay with what you're doing. But that's been my general experience with the medical marijuana. Now, again, and I think I might have talked about this last time, I can't say that I've had a tremendous amount of success with medical marijuana, but the areas that I have had some success are things like anxiety, pain, and sleep. And those are the areas where I've had some people find benefit, continue to use it. Secondarily, if we can help some of those things, it does tend to help the primary symptoms of tremors and things like that. Because I'm sure everybody on this video or on this call knows when they're anxious, they shake more, or when they don't sleep, they don't do as well, or if they're in a lot of pain, they don't move very well. And so secondarily, you can kind of work on Parkinson's symptoms by correcting the thing that's making it worse. And so that's been my experience with the medical marijuana thing. Then I actually tried to look up the next question because I thought I knew the answer, but I wasn't entirely sure. And well, I'm still not entirely sure I know the answer. But the long story short is the CDC has recommended that older folks get a COVID booster of the fall of 23 version of the vaccines. While I had no major problems with the original vaccine, I did have a worsening of my Parkinson's symptoms and contractions in my arms and legs after I had the booster last fall. I returned to normal within about 30 hours after the shot. Is there any data on neurological problems in Parkinson's patients following the use of current vaccine? Should I get the booster per CDC recommendations? I'm a COVID virgin. I was trying to actually see if there were recommendations for this. I was on the Parkinson's Foundation's websites, multiple different foundations websites, Michael J. Fox Foundation websites. I was looking at what a lot of, you know, Mayo Clinic or NYU were recommending, and it's really actually hard to find a definitive yes or no answer. Everybody kind of gives the answer that I give, which is, well, getting COVID isn't very good for you either. And so if it prevents you or helps make COVID less symptomatic or less problematic, then maybe you should get it, unless there's a reason you shouldn't. There is a little bit of literature that I found that does suggest Parkinson's symptoms can get worse after the COVID vaccine. And there was a certain percentage that I can't remember offhand that did require more medicine following the COVID vaccine. And so it's a little bit tough to answer that question because I actually can't find anybody who comes out right and says, yes, this is a good idea, or no, this isn't a good idea. You get all this kind of doctor talk of, well, talk to your doctor, and if there's no major risk, then maybe it's worthwhile. But nobody actually knows the answer to that question. And I don't know the answer to that question either. I have seen patients have worsening of their Parkinson's symptoms after a COVID vaccine. Christine, you want to answer?
No, I don't want to answer, but I
Oh.
just wondered, does it, one question is, if the symptoms worsened, did they remain at that level or did they return? And if you want, we can take a poll on here to see.
I was going to answer that question. I have seen, I would say the vast majority of patients that I have personally seen, now you're getting my opinion. This is not based on fact. This is based on my experience and my opinion. The vast majority of patients that have a problem or worsening of their symptoms after a COVID vaccine get better. However, I have definitively seen patients, not a lot of these patients, but a couple of these patients where they got worse following their COVID vaccine and they continue to do worse, where we had to increase their medicine or we had to intervene. Can I explain that? No. Can I say that, oh, that wasn't the vaccine and that's just, no, it could very well have been the vaccine. I don't see why it couldn't. The caveat to that is I have definitively seen people who got COVID and had significant disease and then had significant worsening of their symptoms. And so the question is, which is worse? And I don't know the answer to that question because I've seen both. In my personal experience, I think I have seen worsening of symptoms more associated with getting COVID than with getting the vaccine, particularly if it's severe disease or if you end up hospitalized because of COVID. Generally thinking about the things the vaccine theoretically makes better or prevents: severe disease, hospitalization, intubation, things like that. And so my first inclination is to say that I think the vaccine is still the better of the choices, but that's subjective. Believe me, I have plenty of patients who disagree with that philosophy. And no matter what I tell them, they say, I'm not getting the vaccine. And I say, okay, this is still America. You're allowed to make your own decision. I'm not here to tell you what to do, usually, except for exercise that you have to do, but everything else is a choice. And because I can't honestly find the answer to that question, I'm not going to sit here and say, this is definitively what you should do. I can tell you my experience, which is that I have seen more people have problems with severe COVID disease than the vaccine, but that's just my experience. And I don't know if that extrapolates to the population, if that is how it would work out if we actually studied this. I think it's probably still too soon to look for literature or look for data on this. Generally they wait longer before they say, publish things like that. But again, if I hear things, and this might be something I look out for at the movement disorder conference coming up in September that I'm going to go to, because I honestly don't know the answer to that question. And I had a hard time finding an easy answer to that question. So again, my general thoughts and my general recommendations at this point is I do think if the CDC thinks you should get the COVID vaccine and there's no obvious glaring reason like you're allergic to it or something like that, you should probably get it. Yes, it can indeed increase or worsen your Parkinson's symptoms. The majority of people that I have seen where their symptoms got worse, their symptoms did get better after a time period, but not always. But I still think it's the safer of the two between that and severe COVID symptoms or disease. So that's my philosophy. Christine, I'm not entirely sure what the poll is.
I'll send it out.
I got something popped up on mine,
Yeah,
but it
forget
was a
that.
different question.
I added that. So I'm gonna do
I'm just
another.
gonna get rid of that. Okay. Well, you send out the poll. I'll keep answering questions, but that's my general thought on that. So I did actually try to find out more scientific evidence on that one, and I really couldn't find anybody who was willing to come out and say, this is what you should do. So I'm not going to come out and say, this is what you should do. I'm going to play the same games everybody else does. Hold that thought. Sorry, I was going to call home one of my partners. My neurosurgeon at AGH, and I only know a couple of neurosurgeons at AGH, so that kind of narrows it down. mentioned brain stimulator to me on Monday, and I need to know all about it. Well, again, I can tell you some about it, maybe not all about it, but some about it. And so I'm assuming you're referring to the deep brain stimulator. So the deep brain stimulator is a surgery that we do for Parkinson's disease. We do it for other things too, but we do it for Parkinson's disease. And the long story short, and I'm going to make this brief because believe it or not, the surgeons are probably the best ones to tell you a lot of the details, the ins and outs about the procedure itself, the risks and really the risks of the procedure and what the surgeon should really talk about. But let me give you a general overview of it. So the long story short is we've been doing deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease for the past 20 plus years. It involves drilling holes into your skull right around here, putting wires deep into your brain into an area, usually the subthalamic nucleus, although sometimes the thalamus, sometimes the globus pallidus. And then we tunnel those wires back here, or sometimes over to one side, and we hook you up to a generator in your chest. This is all internal. There's nothing exposed. And we have had fairly good success controlling symptoms of Parkinson's disease using stimulation. What I mean by that is a lot of the symptoms that people get relief with the medications also tend to get relief with the deep brain stimulator surgery. It's not for everybody. Much like the medicines don't work for everything, deep brain stimulator surgery doesn't work for everything. It tends to be more effective for things like tremors and stiffness and not as good for walking and balance or speech problems. It is invasive. It is brain surgery. You do have holes drilled into your head. You do have internal machinery. And then we can adjust that stimulator via a controller to electrically help control the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. It is not disease modifying as far as we know. It doesn't fix the disease. It doesn't cure the disease or slow down the disease as far as I know, but neither do the medications. It does not make me want to tell you not to exercise. Just get that out of the way right now. You still got to be active. But it is another useful tool in the right person for helping their symptoms. Now, the next obvious question is who's the right person, right? I mean, that's the follow-up question, and that I have an answer to as well. I don't take care of the ideal person. The ideal person would be a healthy person who has had definitive idiopathic Parkinson's disease for at least a few years so that we know that it's true Parkinson's disease and not something else, who generally has tremor predominance, although not necessarily it has to be, who has response to medications, who we've had to increase medicines and are either running into side effects of medicines or problems with medicines, who also doesn't have any other reasons why we can't do brain surgery, who isn't having any balance problems and isn't having any memory problems. That would probably be the ideal person. Now, again, the ideal person does not usually walk into my office. I take care of much more complicated people than that. And so we do pick and choose who the right person is. Again, it's all about weighing out risks and benefits. Everything we do is about risks and benefits. Everything we do is trying to aim at quality of life. How can I get you to be able to do some of the things you want to do easier or better? And what is the least amount of risk we can do to do that? Now, obviously, brain surgery, in my opinion, since I'm not a surgeon, is a little bit riskier than taking a pill. Pills have side effects too, don't get me wrong. There is no perfect medicine or treatment option. But again, I feel like the vast majority of my patients would rather try a medicine as opposed to having holes drilled into their head. I might be guessing on that, but I doubt it. Maybe we need another poll on that one. But at the end of the day, if we do run into problems with medicines, or if you're not doing as well as we would like, or you've been dealing with this for a long time, or we still have a long time to go, surgery is a really useful option. It's another tool that we have to try to help you feel better. Is it for everybody? No. If you have bad memory problems, you're not going to be a good candidate. If you're falling all the time, it's not going to be my favorite choice. If you don't respond to the medicine, it's not going to be my favorite choice. But in the right person, in the right situation, with the right goal in mind and the right expectations in mind, it's a really good treatment strategy, or it does help a lot of people. Now, a lot of my job comes down to managing expectations because I have unfortunately seen people not very well expectation managed by other providers, and they're not happy. And it's because they're told it's a cure, they're told they're going to come off of all their medicines or whatever, things that really are not true. And then they're not happy about it. And so my patients, if we're talking about deep brain stimulator surgery, I'm not going to say, hey, this is going to fix you, this is going to cure you, and this is going to take the place of all your medicines. I'm going to say this is another tool that I have to try to help you feel better. Oftentimes we are able to cut back medications, but it's not the goal. The goal is to get you doing better. And usually that requires both medications and stimulation of varying amounts to see if we can achieve that goal. That's basically my interpretation or my spiel for deep brain stimulator surgery when we're talking about it. If you really want to know the ins and outs about how they do the procedure, what it's like, what are the risks of surgery, which I know a little bit, but it's best comes from a neurosurgeon. They're the ones who do the procedure. We have two guys at Allegheny Health Network who do the procedure, and I like both of them. In fact, I have a meeting with them tomorrow because we have a monthly deep brain stimulator surgery meeting. It's at 6:30 in the morning because when you go to certain meetings that are run by surgeons, you do it at 6:30 in the morning. And so we talk about everybody too. And so we go over it in advance, what we're going to do, why we're going to do it, who we're not going to do. But again, the surgeons are probably the best ones to give you the detailed information about the procedure itself. I can just tell you who we use it and why we use it for them. Can I please touch base on internal tremors and new solutions to potentially help them? Yes and no. Internal tremors are exactly what they sound like. I have a lot of patients who either one of the first symptoms or as it evolves, they develop it is an internal tremor. And it's a tremor that they feel like they're shaking on the inside, but you can't see anything outwardly, or you see only minimal outwardly. A lot of times it's a whole body thing. It can be in the chest, it can be in a limb, but it really is more internal. They feel it subjectively more than I can see it in the office. It's actually not that uncommon. People don't often talk about it, but it's not all that uncommon. The general treatment strategy is I generally treat internal tremors the same way I treat external tremors or outward tremors, and it's with medicines. Generally, or at least some of the time, the medicines that I use to try to calm down tremors, calm down internal tremors too, although not always. And a lot of people know that the medicines that I use don't always take away outward tremors either. In fact, tremors are sometimes really hard to make go away completely. I don't think there's anything new, at least not that I've stumbled across or not that I've read specifically for internal tremors or really for tremors in general that's better than what we've traditionally had or the medicines we've traditionally used. But I'm always keeping my eye out because it is a problem. And just because your tremor is internal doesn't mean it's not a problem. Doesn't mean it can't bother you. You know, just because I can't see your tremor doesn't mean you're going to come to my office and say I have an internal tremor and I'm going to say, no, you don't. That would be silly. I try not to do silly stuff. And just because it's an internal tremor doesn't mean I'm not going to take it as seriously as I would an external tremor, because I've had plenty of patients where that internal tremor drives them crazy, keeps them up at night, keeps them from wanting to go do things, and we treat it just the same. Again, my treatment strategy usually comes down to if your symptoms are impacting your day-to-day life, if they're bothering you, if they're keeping you from doing things, then we got to do something about it. And if that's an internal tremor, it's just as serious or as real as an external tremor. I thought this was an interesting question too. Since many patients with Parkinson's are older and have falls, do you recommend taking calcium supplements? I never honestly really thought about it. You know, I usually defer things like that to primary care doctors when they're doing bone density scans, you know, diagnosing osteoporosis, osteopenia, which I don't do. And so I usually kind of leave that up to the primary care doctor to say, hey, you should be on calcium, you should be on vitamin D, but you should be on the osteoporosis medicines or the osteopenia medicine. Sometimes there's infusions or the bisphosphonates. I'm not very expert in those. And so I generally, that thought never really occurred to me, in all honesty, to say, hey, you've had some falls, maybe you've broken something, maybe you should be on calcium replacement. Maybe I should, and maybe I will if I think about it. It's probably not a bad idea. I don't know of any major risks with taking calcium supplementation. Again, you should probably check with your PCP to make sure I'm not making that up. But the short answer is no. I never really have recommended calcium supplements to patients, but maybe I'll at least think about it. Maybe it'll cross my mind now and I'll start saying, you know, maybe your bones are a little bit brittle. Maybe you're a fall risk. Maybe you should be on calcium. I don't know that I've ever seen any literature on that either in the Parkinson's population, although I never actually looked, so it could exist. A lot of my patients are vitamin D deficient. Most people in Pittsburgh are vitamin D deficient. We don't get a lot of sunlight. And so there's probably a good amount that are calcium low or deficient as well. And so the short answer is I don't think I ever once have recommended calcium replacement to any of my patients. But it might not be a bad idea. If you want to take calcium, knock yourself out. And maybe I will start checking or asking or talking about it with people. So thanks for the update. And then the last one that I got was another video. And since it was from the Today Show, I can only imagine that I'm going to be answering this question for the next month or two. Was thoughts on rock climbing. And they actually sent me the video, which I did watch from the Today Show, where they showed, and this was based down in Washington, D.C. I think they said he was a retired anesthesiologist who was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and then he was looking for a place where he could go rock climbing, and he stumbled or called this rock climbing instructor, and she jumped on it. Now they have upwards of, I don't remember what the number they said, but it was a lot of people with Parkinson's disease and coming and doing a rock climbing. And I thought about this as she was describing it, is rock climbing is tremendous exercise. I've never once seen an out of shape rock climber. And she even mentioned it emphasizes big movements, but also fine motor control, grip strength. You know, Joan, I see you on there. Don't worry. I know you're big on the rock climbing world. And so at the end of the day, I think it's a great idea. And so I tasked Casey with figuring out how we set stuff like this up, which I don't know if that's possible, but we'll figure it out or we'll look into it. The short answer is I don't think there's anything magical about rock climbing, but what a great exercise. And it looked like a lot of fun. And it seemed fairly safe. Again, you're tethered in, you're on belay. And so again, somebody is there to kind of lower you down if there's a problem. I don't really see any downsides to it. And so, hey, if you guys wanted to start rock climbing, knock yourself out. The one thing that did make me laugh, and I mentioned this before we got on the air, was and I forget the instructor's name, I'm sorry, but if you Google the Today Show, I'm sure you could find it. But she made a comment about she's studying this and she's trying to publish on this with the hope that insurance would cover it. And that made me chuckle because insurance doesn't cover anything. And believe me, if we can get them to cover rock climbing, man, I can't wait to think of the other things maybe we could get insurances to cover, like medicines that actually work or things like that. But it was an interesting video, and again, I'm all for it if people want to try to set up a group like that, or we can find a gym. You know, I liken it to the boxing class. It's a great exercise. It's a great support group. It's fun. The people on the video who were doing the rock climbing also looked like they were having a lot of fun. I see no downsides to it. All right, that was all I had in my email. Now I'm scrolling up to the real questions. Does nutrition play a role in helping people with Parkinson's disease? Probably. There's a lot less written about nutrition than there is exercise. There's tons of stuff written about exercise, but there's actually a lot less written or more definitive about nutrition. I remember this was probably a year or two ago. I got a whole movement disorder journal dedicated to nutrition, but that was really about it. And I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but the conclusion was that the Mediterranean diet is probably the best diet for people with Parkinson's disease and may have some benefit in their progression in physical symptoms. I don't think they really went out on a limb on that one because the Mediterranean diet is probably the best diet on the planet for everybody on the planet. But it's also really hard to stick to in Pittsburgh. You know, the Mediterranean diet involves a lot of fish, a lot of greens, a lot of beans, a lot of legumes, olive oil, not a lot of red meat, and virtually no processed food. Not a lot of things we have easy access to here in Pittsburgh, not being a beach town, at least not until global warming makes us a beach town. And so that's really all that I've ever really stumbled across where they made comments about what's good or what isn't. There's been hit or miss things about dairy being problematic in people with Parkinson's disease. There's been hit or miss things about inflammatory diets. There's been a couple of things suggested about like intermittent fasting or diets of that nature, but not a lot of good evidence. And these are hard things to study. Diet studies are really hard to do because it's hard to get people randomized to them. It's hard to get people to stick to them. It's hard to get good information and data. So diet trials are really hard. They're even harder to do than exercise trials. But so the short answer is there's not a lot of great evidence for nutrition, diet, and Parkinson's disease, at least not when it comes to controlled studies. My general thought is healthy diet is probably best. As close to healthy as you can do is probably best. I think if you can be healthier in your diet, it probably will help you do better overall. But that's about as kind of concrete as we got. Does aspiration on a barium swallow make somebody not a candidate for DBS? I wouldn't say it necessarily excludes you as a candidate, but it doesn't make me feel good about it. And the reason I say that is, again, the deep brain stimulator is good for some things, but it actually can make some things worse. And some of those things are balance. Some of those things are speech and swallowing. And so while, again, first we would probably have to figure out why you're aspirating, or is there something that we could do about it? And if we could correct it either through speech therapy or, working with the exercises from a speech program, then I don't see why that would limit or hinder your ability to be a deep brain stimulator candidate. Now, if you're aspirating because you have severe swallowing problems or because this is more of an atypical Parkinsonism, then that wouldn't be a great idea to do DBS. But if it really is just aspiration because the swallowing muscles are weak and that can be worked on, I don't think that would be a hard no from a DBS, but it would be definitely something that I would think and we would have to talk about in terms of what it was, where we thought it was coming from, what the progression is, and what the expectation was before we decided to do surgery on somebody like that. Got worse after COVID vaccine or COVID itself? Yes. There's a question mark, so I'm going to answer yes. I have had patients that did both. And again, I really do think the vast majority that I have seen have gotten worse with the disease itself than the vaccine, but that is not 100%. What about taking PEX Lovid? Again, that's another question that I've gotten recently. I don't know of any interactions of PEX Lovid with any of the medicines that I traditionally use. And again, if PEX Lovid is recommended by the primary care doctor, the pulmonologist, or whoever, I don't think there's a good definitive reason why just because you have Parkinson's disease or you're taking Parkinson's disease medicines, you shouldn't take it. In fact, I think just the opposite of that. I think if PEX Lovid really does what they tell me PEX Lovid does, and I also am a COVID virgin, believe it or not. I have never once had COVID as far as I know, and I've never had PEX Lovid. But if it does what they think it does, then I think it's worth taking. And I don't think there's any contraindications just because you're a patient with Parkinson's disease or you're on Parkinson's disease medicines. If they think PEX Lovid makes sense, I think PEX Lovid makes sense. I have no idea what the requirements or what the conditions are for getting PEX Lovid, so don't ask that. I would say ask your primary care doctor. You don't want a brain doctor treating lung diseases, that's for sure. I'm not very good at it. Any thoughts, opinion on the Celestrate for PD trial being conducted at University of Rochester, or the Topaz trial? So the Topaz trial I'm aware of, that they're looking at fractures and bone density in people with Parkinson's disease. I'd have to look up, is the Celestrate the same thing? Or are they looking at similar things in bone density? I'm not sure. The short answer is falling is not good, and it's even worse or less good if you have bad bones. I don't think I'm going out on a limb on that one. And so at the end of the day, if zoledronic acid, which I always have a hard time saying, or any of the medicines that we use for brittle bone disease or osteoporosis or osteopenia also help prevent fractures in people with Parkinson's disease because they have a tendency to fall, then it's a great idea. Again, I also don't know the qualifications or what you have to qualify to get those medicines. Again, I don't usually take care of bone disease. That would be a primary care doctor or rheumatologist or somebody like that. But again, I think logically it makes sense. If you're somebody who is prone to falls, you would be better off falling with better bones than less good bones. And so again, I think that's definitely what the Topaz trial is looking at. If that's what the Celestrate trial is looking at too, then I think it makes sense. And at the end of the day, if these things do pan out, then maybe they will be more aggressive in bone treatment if you do have the disease of Parkinson's disease. But I think more to come. I think we need to wait and see what the studies look at, but I think logically it does make sense. If you're somebody who has osteoporosis or osteopenia or easily fractured bones, and your primary care doctor or your somebody is saying, hey, you should be on this medicine to strengthen up your bones, it's probably a good idea. Have I heard of habituation with DBS? Yep. The need maybe for altering stimulation patterns on a weekly basis to avoid habituation from constant stimulation over an extended period of time. Yeah. And so they've actually been looking at this in terms of varying the stimulation patterns, either not even just weekly, but even daily or even kind of just in the loop itself. And this is where they were also looking at, could we get away with stimulating and then shutting it off, and then stimulating and shutting it off. So they're looking at this because it does seem like with the deep brain stimulator, it does tend to not be as effective over time. Now, again, this is a hard question to answer because, again, medicines aren't as effective over time. The disease progresses over time. So is it really habituation or, becoming used to the medicine, or is it just that the disease is progressing? And I don't know how we distinguish between those factors. Maybe they're looking at it in the research trials, but the short answer is yes, they are looking at alternating patterns, changing frequencies, changing stimulations to try to avoid that kind of a thing. And again, if you're somebody who gets deep brain stimulator surgery and we're adjusting your DBS, we're going to be trying all of these different things. We try all of these. There's infinity ways you can program a DBS. There's an actual number. I just don't remember what the number is. And so we're going to be working on all of these things again to see if we can get your quality of life better. And that is one of the things that is being looked at. Have I heard anything about stem cell therapy for Parkinson's disease? And the short answer is yes. I can't say that I've heard anything new recently. We've been looking at stem cells for a long time, dating back to, I forget when, but a long time, more than 20 years. And generally we have not been tremendously successful. I'm going to put an asterisk there. Generally, we have not been tremendously successful. So early trials of stem cells in Parkinson's disease were basically aimed at, can we take stem cells and turn them into dopamine producing cells? Yes. Can we take said dopamine producing cells and plant them into a person? Yes. Can we get said stem cells that are producing dopamine that we have implanted into a person to work? Yes. Can we control it? Maybe. And that's where the sticking point has usually been. A couple of the people, not all, some people were in the early trials that I think they were doing out of Canada. Some of the patients did extremely well, but there were at least 1 or 2 patients that had runaway dyskinesias, meaning they couldn't control the dopamine production. It was overstimulating things and they couldn't stop moving. And so that was the initial foray into stem cells in Parkinson's disease, because again, when you think about the neurodegenerative diseases, meaning loss of brain, regardless of what the study that I looked at earlier said, potentially loss of the brain cells, your brain does not regrow cells very well. It does some, but not very well. And so theoretically, if you lost brain cells, it would make a whole lot of sense that if we could regrow brain cells or replace those brain cells, that could potentially fix the problem. And that's why stem cells exist. That's why stem cells are being looked at. The data at this point's been iffy, though, and there are still people working on it. But we have not had good long-term success without complications in that many patients. And now stem cells are also really hard to study because the government gets involved and they make things really hard to do, shockingly. And so it's not like these studies are easily reproducible and easy to do. The caveat to that is there was a paper that I think came out 2 or 3 years ago that was one patient that they did at Harvard where it worked. They actually took his own stem cells, they took his blood, they spun it down, they did some fancy techniques, they implanted it, and it worked. There were a couple limitations to this, and this is where I get questionable when I try to extrapolate this. So one is it's one patient. One patient is not enough to actually make recommendations on. And in the fine print, when you're reading the study, they also mentioned, oh, by the way, he funded it. And yes, stem cells are ridiculously expensive. And so he funded the study. Yeah, I'm not even going to call it a study. We're going to call it an attempt. He funded it and it worked. And so I don't know. There's a lot of bias there, I think. I don't think I can extrapolate from that. We can say that maybe it is plausible, possible, a potential treatment option down the road. But the short answer is I don't think we're there yet. I do think it logically or in theory makes for a great idea. But we need to be able to do it well. We need to be able to control it, which means we need to be able to get it incorporated into your natural brain mechanisms. And I don't think we've been able to figure that out yet. But more to come. That's another thing that there will probably be a poster or something about at the meeting. So more to come about that. What are the most dangerous bad side effects of having a bad DBS program activated? And is it always reversible? Does it depend on? Ooh, I don't know. I would imagine I would imagine if you have a bad DBS settings, you're probably going to throw off your walking imbalance. It's probably going to make your speech worse. It can give you double vision, blurry vision. And really it's because, and just to give you some insight into the brain. So the subthalamic nucleus is usually the nucleus that we aim for in Parkinson's disease. It's like a centimeter or two by like half a centimeter. That's how big this thing is. And the goal is to stick the lead in, or the contact into the correct portion of this tiny nucleus. And so again, there's a lot of potential for error there in terms of anatomy. The side effects usually come because when you stimulate in this area, it stimulates the areas around the subthalamic nucleus. So that's where we usually see the side effects, because we're stimulating areas of the brain that we're not trying to. And this is what the deep brain stimulator people have tried to invent, different ways to shape the stimulation or aim the stimulation to try to avoid that. That's why they came up with the different kinds of contacts, the different leads, so on and so forth. I don't think I've ever seen somebody have side effects to the DBS that were not reversible by simply turning it off. But when we think about, and this is I'm making this up, so take this with a grain of salt. When we think about kindling in epilepsy, and so what that means is if you have a focus of seizure and you have frequent seizures, it can then in and of itself create another focus of seizure. Could you potentially have a kindling effect with the stimulation from the DBS? I don't know that that's ever been proven. And so again, coming back to the second part of your question, which is if you've been on this bad program for a long time and it was stimulating or the wrong part of your brain, could that lead to permanent changes? Theoretically, in my simple brain, it's possible. I have never seen that. I don't know that I've ever read a paper about that or read a case report about that, but is it feasible or possible? I would say maybe. I don't know if that answered the questions, but hopefully. You and me both. I am so frustrated. And just, I'm going to stop there because I think actually the number one word in my office is frustrated. Frustration is probably the number one. Fatigue and tiredness is the number one complaint. But I think frustration is the number one overarching theme in the office when I'm taking care of people with Parkinson's disease. It's just, it's so hard to deal with. It is so frustrating, and I don't say this from experience, but I hear this so many times that I feel like it's almost like I've experienced, although I have not. Take that with a grain of salt. It's frustrating that I can't do the things that I used to be able to do. It's frustrating that I can't do the things that I want to do. It's frustrating because the people telling me what to do don't understand what I have to. If you would have watched the skit at the conference, I think frustration was like the theme of, what's his face acting out, his progression through the disease. And so frustration is like the number one overarching theme in my office. And not just you, I get frustrated too, although not nearly as much and to the same extent, but I'm so frustrated. My sister was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2019, and she flat out refuses to participate in exercising and being active, but complains about pain and anxiety. Any suggestions on how to get motivated? Motivation, I talk about motivation 15 times a day in the office because it is hard. And I don't like to give you an excuse, but I'm going to give you an excuse. And it actually, I don't know what this says about my brain, but it actually took me a really long time to figure this out and come to this conclusion. So it turns out dopamine doesn't just make you move. Dopamine is also your reward chemical. And so again, if something good happens, you get flooded with dopamine and you feel good about it. That's what makes you want to do it again, right? Well, guess what? If you don't have enough dopamine, and that's why you're not moving very well, you also don't have enough dopamine to get that reward. That does not give you a lot of motivation to get up and do it again. And so some of lack of motivation can be blamed on the lack of dopamine. This is not giving you an excuse, but it's sort of giving you an excuse. The downside to that philosophy is the medicines that we use to replace dopamine don't seem to impact that pathway nearly as much. With the exception of maybe Mirapex or Pramipexole, I have not run into a medicine that is really all that motivating. And I've tried everything. I've tried dopamine medicines, I've tried stimulants, I've tried antidepressants, I've tried you name it. I have a hard time finding medicines that motivate people. And pain makes it so much harder, and anxiety makes it so much harder. And so what I would recommend is try to work on the pain and anxiety first. If the anxiety is an issue, psychiatry is a great choice. If pain is an issue, maybe we need a pain specialist or orthopedist or physical therapy. At the end of the day, it's such a tough thing to get past, and motivation is such a hard thing to get. And yes, it's very easy for you. And again, this was in the skit too. It's very easy for you to come to my office and I say, you need to exercise more. And I do, believe me, if you come to my office, I almost guarantee I say you need to exercise more. And it is extremely easy for me to say that. And it is extremely hard to do. And yes, I am well aware of that. But I don't have a solution for it. I usually say exercise is the one thing that I found that gives people motivation or a little bit of energy, or everybody feels better when they do it. But how do you get somebody to do it? There still has to be that internal motivation to get up and do it. I have not run into success with external motivation, aka nagging. That I don't think ever once has solved the motivation problem in my experience. And so that is an incredibly frustrating problem, but an incredibly common problem that I run into the office. And I have yet to actually figure out a good solution for it. Support groups are help. Exercise classes are help. The Parkinsons Foundation, Western Pennsylvania, great help. I mean, just trying to get people on the correct path to start. But it's tough, and I don't have any magic words of wisdom, and I don't have any way to make you not frustrated, because again, frustration is the number one thing that I deal with in my office. You just have to keep working on the barriers and the limitations to getting people to move. This was an interesting, so I was asked at a recent office visit, I was asked about peptide AOD 9064. And I did look it up. So peptide therapy is apparently a thing these days. I haven't heard much about it, but it's being used for a whole lot of things. Now, when I looked up peptide 9064, it was a lot about weight loss. And so again, it may also be used for other things, but I have not seen it actually looked at or researched at Parkinson's disease or people with walking problems. And so I haven't had a chance to come across that. But I did find other peptides that are all being looked at in a variety of different medical conditions. And I do think, again, more to come. I liken the peptide therapy to a lot of the other alternative medicine treatments. Again, I'm not against any of the alternative medicine treatments. I'm not here to tell you can or can't do things. I usually kind of use the same rules of thumb with things like that as I do with anything else, which is there should be some science behind it. It shouldn't be toxic. And don't put yourself in the poorhouse doing it. But otherwise, if you want to try these things, I'm fine with it. But that's what I found when I looked at that peptide specifically, is I didn't find as much as I was hoping for from a walking standpoint, but I found more from a weight loss standpoint. Loss of symptom control and resulting muscle contractions due to habituation. Disturbance of gait in bilateral implanted patients, and stimulation-induced dysarthria and dyskinesia. I don't see a question there, Donna, but at the end of the day, yes, I do agree with all of those things. I have seen all of those things, and these are some of the issues that we run into DBS. And all of these things, maybe not the habituation thing, but definitely the other things play a role in deciding, do I think you're a very good deep brain stimulator candidate? Again, I am not eager to send somebody to DBS if they're falling all the time. Again, not that that's an absolute contraindication, but it doesn't make me feel good about it. Or if you already have speech and swallowing problems, again, it's not a hard no, but it definitely makes me pause and say, is this really the best thing that I have to offer? Memory problems are a hard no. So we actually send people for memory testing. And if you don't score a certain level, it's almost a hard cutoff where we say just about across the board no. But a lot of these other things are more subjective. There are not a lot of hard definitive yes and no answers in my world. And this isn't just true for DBS, it's true for everything that I do. And so again, everything has to be taken in the context. And everything has to be taken as a whole to decide who's a good surgical candidate and who isn't. Light therapy. So the Celeste light therapy trial is it's conducted, is looking at light therapy. So I wonder if that's looking at like light box treatment, because that's been looked at in Parkinson's disease, particularly people with depression. That tends to help give people a little boost of energy, or what specific. I'll have to look that one up. So I'll look up the Celeste light therapy trial. And then I'll get back to you and give you more information on that. But I wonder if that's what they're looking at. Of course, I don't have any sticky notes. There we go. I can never have sticky notes. My desk is covered in sticky notes, but I never have a sticky note handy when I need one. Let me write that one down, and I'll tell you more about the light therapy trial next time. If it's what I think it is, then again, it's been looked at before, and it does tend to help. But let me look at this out of Rochester before I comment on that one. I'll tell you about it next time. It's a great question. How many deep brain stimulator programmers? A lot of DBS questions these days, which is fine. How many programmers do we have? Not nearly enough. That's the short answer. So two of the main ones that we had for the past 20 years both retired on me. We still have 2 out of neurosurgery, and I have 1 at the moment just getting up and running in neurology. Theoretically, I have another PA that I'm training right now in movement disorders. So part of her training is going to be DBS. And so more to come. I also have 2 movement disorder specialists starting up in September. So there's a light on the horizon. But right now, the short answer is not enough and too many. Because the next question is, how many DBS patients do they serve, and how long do you have to wait for a programming appointment? I don't know how long you have to wait. It's probably forever. That's how long the wait in everything in medicine is these days, which is very, very unfortunate. But just the facts of life. I'm not sure how many DBS patients we actually have or take care of, in all honesty. That's a number I should probably figure out. But at the end of the day, the short answer is not enough. We definitely need more doctors. We need more movement disorder specialists, and we need more people who can do deep brain stimulator adjustments. Because again, more aggressive things may be the wave of the future, and we need people who can manage these things. So I don't know the specific numbers on them, but the short answer is not enough. And I only got one more question, and I got 5 minutes to answer it. So I'd say we're doing pretty good. If someone experienced seizures following DBS, will the seizures go away when the DBS device is removed? Maybe. Now, the hard part about DBS and removing it is when you put the wires in, it does actually make a hole. And so there is somewhat of a lesion created. Now, we've been doing lesions for forever, 100 years. We can put a hole in somebody's brain and we can stop symptoms. And you do indeed create a little bit of a lesion when you put in the wires. And we know this because a lot of times when you put in the wires, before you even start stimulating, some of the symptoms get better, or can. And that's generally thought to be part of the lesion component of it, which is, you make a small hole. That hole doesn't go away if you do indeed have to remove or explant the deep brain stimulator wires. So theoretically, if you have created a lesion and that lesion has seeded an area of epilepsy or seizure, it might not go away. But I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know what percentage of people, because I also don't know what percentage of people have it taken out. Removal of a DBS is actually fairly rare, fairly uncommon. Even if you get a bad infection, it's usually the generator or the connector lead that has to be changed. Don't get me wrong, we've had people that have had to be explanted and taken the lead out, but it's actually not that common. And I don't know if that's ever been looked at specifically in seizure. Again, I think that could go either way. If it's from the stimulation or the procedure itself, maybe those seizures go away and never come back. But if it's because you now have a lesion in your brain or a hole in your brain and that's irritating to nerve system, that could lead to seizures too. So I'm not sure. And believe it or not, Casey, I finished 3 minutes early with the questions. I feel like this is a record. I don't know if this has ever happened or will ever happen again.
I don't think so.
Hey, I'll take it. Donna's got her. I knew it was too good to be true.
Okay.
Donna had her hand up, and since I got 3 minutes to go, Donna, go ahead.
I just wondered, a clarification. Did you say your 2 seasoned 20-year-old veteran programmers retired?
Yeah, so Dr. Burke was one of our physiatrists over at West Penn who did a lot of our DBS, especially in people who were in rehab, retired. And then Renee, who was our nurse practitioner here, also left.
Because I bring up all these questions about DBS because it's a catastrophe coming up. All these people want DBS. The seasoned programmers, it's all open loop programming. So the more experience they have, the better, because there's, like you said, a million different parameters. And then if you get put on a bad program, sometimes you don't see the result of a programming session till hours or days later.
And sometimes it initially gets better and then it doesn't.
Right.
And so, yes, we need more people who can do it. And it's a downside to everything in medicine. For instance, it's not just DBS. If you want an appointment with me, good luck. I mean, just appointments for movement disorder specialists in general are just incredibly hard to find, incredibly difficult to get, and it takes forever. And it's just the state of affairs in medicine across the board from what I gather. And it's a big problem. It is a huge problem for people who fluctuate frequently, who need frequent appointments, who we need to adjust things, not just DBS, but medicines, therapies, you name it. It's a real big problem that I don't have a good solution for. Again, I do have a light at the end of the tunnel. I have a couple of people starting soon. I have more APPs that we're training, so it's not all bad news. But current state of affairs, it is rough.
How much training do the PAs that are doing programming get from the DBS companies?
So generally each company, and there's 3 companies available that have DBS, have their own courses that they take. So they usually do all 3 of them. And then they spend time with Cindy or Amanda here, learning how they do things and seeing how the seasoned people who are still left do it, train them a little bit. And then each time they bring in a rep from the company to help them, at least early on, do DBS adjustments together until they get a feel for it, some experience, and then they can do it on their own.
So the DBS, the reps in Pittsburgh do programming on patients.
They theoretically can, and in my office, what we do is we bring them in with, say, my nurse practitioner, Casey, who does DBS programming now. We'll bring in Megan or one of the other reps from the companies, and they'll do it together in the office. One last question that I'm going to end with, which is I exercise 2 to 3 hours per day, but have not been able to gain weight, drink shakes, etc. daily. Any suggestions? High calorie things. So milkshakes are good, peanut butter milkshakes, ice cream, high calorie things. Again, I love the exercise, keep doing it, but man, at the end of the day, weight loss is, and that actually goes back to the next one, which is weight loss is a big issue. All right, I got 30 seconds to answer this question. This is the last one I'm going to answer, I promise. So in Parkinson's disease, the entire GI system is impacted. Not only do you get constipation, but stomach emptying is slow, gastric motility, intestinal motility, they're all affected. And so not only are you constipated, which doesn't make you want to eat, when you do eat, you fill up quicker because it doesn't exit your stomach quickly. So that makes you full quicker and it makes you not eat very much. So eating less plus constant tremors and stiffness, which burns a lot of calories, makes people lose weight all the time. Maintaining weight is actually very difficult. And so a lot of my patients do become ice creamaholics or junk food eaters. And that's actually okay in my world because it helps them maintain weight. And so the short answer to the weight loss is you really have to pack in the calories. Again, I don't want you to stop working out or stop exercising. That's still key to success, but making sure you're eating more and usually kind of high calorie, frequent small meals, because at the end of the day, your stomach emptying problem is going to limit how much you can eat. And it's not going to be enough. So eating more frequent meals tends to help with that. All right, Casey, I promise I will stop there and I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Leichliter. We'll see you on June 6th for the next talk with the doc. Bye, everybody.
Sounds like a plan. Thanks, guys.